Psalms chapter 32. Psalm chapter 32, verses 10 and 11. Many sorrows shall be to the wicked, but he who trusts in the Lord, mercy shall surround him. Be glad in the Lord and rejoice, you righteous, and shout for joy, all you upright in heart.
So in these verses, it talks about the idea of steadfast love being surrounding us for those who trust in the Lord. And you know, whenever you buy a car, have you ever noticed that when you get a new car, whether it's used or whatever, you start noticing how many people have that car? You know, when I first noticed this Hebrew word that is translated steadfast love in the Old Testament, I hadn't really grasped how often it is in the Old Testament, partly because it's translated, ESV translated steadfast love. A number of other translations use the word loving kindness. But if the word is translated, it's a Hebrew word, kind of pronounced hesed, but it's translated love, mercy, kindness, goodness, beauty, and steadfast love, as ESV does. It has this really kind of overarching idea about it. And when I really began to learn about it a few years back, and I began to see it like, wow, that's all over the New Testament, but you didn't really notice because all kinds of different words were translated in English. And so you can't really see it in English. And wait a second. And I noticed that it really carries with it, I think, the New Testament concept of grace. And very often, a lot of Christians have thought that grace is a New Testament, a new covenant thing in Christ. That it wasn't already there. That it was just something that came about. But then in the Old Testament, it was just God was really mean and he gave a bunch of hard laws and nobody could keep them. And he got mad at them all the time. And yet, when you think that, and Christianity in the last couple thousand years has thought that a lot. And I mean teachers of it, followers of Christianity have come to those conclusions quite a bit, that we miss that covenant. That God, even in that first covenant with Moses, even though it was insufficient to truly save us, that God's steadfast love, his loving kindness, his mercy, his grace was always there. And it surrounded those who trusted him. That is actually the New Testament, New Covenant idea of those who have faith. Because the New Covenant, the New Testament, when it talks about faith, it's not just talking about something you believe, it's talking about something you trust. Do you trust him? Do you believe him to the point that you trust him? And God is actually telling us, and especially we're going to look at this psalm, in Psalm 32. We're going to read through the whole thing. The focus we've already had read for us, 10 and 11. But we're going to understand a few things about God's salvation and his taking care of and watching over and forgiving those who trust him. And he gives us a really great analogy that as we get through here, I'm going to use at least one that, and it also springs to my mind, images as well. But I want to look at, just to start, and in Psalm 32, in verses 1 through 5, and let me just kind of switch over since I don't have it on my screen here. That's what Mark was trying to do, get this screen working, and it's not. But I have it on my own tablet. But let's just read the first 5 verses of Psalm 32. Blessed is the one whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered. Blessed is the man against whom the Lord counts no iniquity, and in whose spirit there is no deceit. For when I kept silent, my bones wasted away through my groaning all day long. For day and night your hand was heavy upon me. My strength was dried up as by the heat of summer. I acknowledged my sin to you, and I did not cover my iniquity. I said, I will confess my transgressions to the Lord, and you forgave the iniquity of my sin. Now, I want you to notice a couple things about the blessing that we have of our sins being covered. He uses the word covered here a whole bunch of times. And he uses them in different ways in here in these first 5 verses. So first off, notice that he talks about how blessed we are when our spirit is without deceit. What does that mean? That I'm not lying. That my spirit isn't lying to myself, that I'm not hiding things, that I'm not deceitful, that I'm truthful. Not just telling everything to everybody, but I'm truthful with me. I don't hide the fact that I stumble, I fall. My spirit knows that. But sometimes we get caught up in excusing ourselves. Because it's really easy to do because we don't call them excuses. What do we call it? Reasons. Here are the reasons why I did this. Here are the reasons why I did that. I almost always have a reason for what I do. Sometimes it's just it's just desire. It's like, I don't want to eat candy. I don't want to eat sugar. And I've mostly cut sugar out of my life. But then when it hangs around and just sits there in the form of like a cupcake, I can walk by it 9 out of 10 times. And I'm feeling pretty strong. But I'm not going to walk by it 10 out of 10. So best for me, I got to get rid of that cupcake. I got to not have it around me. Because I'm not strong enough to overcome it all the time. And sometimes we just want stuff. And so it leads us and it draws us. We always have reasons for what we do. Those reasons, though, do not excuse the sin, the transgression we commit. And so in this passage, he's trying to get us to understand how blessed we are when our sin is covered. By the way, in that passage, it is not covered by ourselves. It's what people who understand grammar, it's what's called, it's in passive. It means it's happened to me. It was done to me. Somebody covered it for me. I didn't cover it. I didn't hide it. Somebody covered it for me. And that's what he's talking about. That's when we're blessed, when our sin has been covered by someone else. The someone else in this passage is God. He's the one that doesn't see the iniquity anymore. And so, but he also mentions the idea that when we hide our sin, life overwhelms us. Notice that when he talks about, when I kept silent in verse 3, my bones wasted away through my groaning all day long. So I was hiding it. I was not letting others know. I was not confessing it or praying it to God. I was covering it and going, oh no, it's not a problem. It's not a problem. And what happened was I was overwhelmed. I keep feeling, it's almost like having an infection. You know, if you have an infection somewhere, even a little one, get a little cut or something, and in the process of moving, I realized I cut my hands all over, just little teeny nicks. And a number of them I didn't really clean well right away, and they became kind of big red lumps, right? We always know what happened, right? An infection, some bacteria and things that are all around us all the time. You get a little nick, if you don't clean it, gets in there, and it's going to sit below the surface. And what's it going to do? It's going to fester. Without being cut out, without being opened up, without being cleaned, what you're going to force is your body to attack it and go to war with that bacteria in that area for a while. Now, Some of them I didn't cut open, and I just, let time and my own immune system deal with it. But they remained swollen and infected for, a week, a number of them. And that's what happens to us emotionally, though, as well. It's what happens to us mentally when we cover trauma, when we cover difficulties, when we cover sin. It hurts us. It isn't what sin does to others that is so damaging as far as our perspective. It's obviously damaging to others, but it's what sin does to us that really hurts us. It's why we needed God and Christ's his sacrifice so bad. Because there was no way we could ultimately take care of that festering wound of sin. We don't have what we need. There is no immune system to deal with the festering problems of life. And so God himself is the one who intervenes. That's what he's talking about. And he says in verse 4, day and night your hand was heavy upon me. What does he mean? I'm groaning, I'm wasting away, I'm struggling, my strength is dried up, I'm tired, I'm exhausted, I have no energy because I am emotionally, physically, mentally drained by sin. In fact, there are thoughts that, in fact, a number of places in Scripture talk about the idea that process of sin can really work to hurt us in the flesh. That we actually suffer in the flesh because of this difficulty of sin. That it affects us, our immune systems. They talk about joy, right? Joy and happiness. How does that affect your immune system? Studies have shown it has an effect on your health. Most doctors now, whatever you're trying to get treated and things, especially for anything serious, they want you to be mentally strong. They want you to be mentally up. And that's why we carry the idea of fighting sometimes illness. That I'm battling. That I'm not giving up. That I'm not shrinking back. Because our mind has such a tremendous impact on our body and the physical health of our body. That we feel the effect. That's what he's talking about. His sin caused a physical effect on his body. Now, I think a lot of times we sometimes just struggle. We say we have no time, we have no energy, we're drained, we're doing too much, well, sometimes we're just covering too much. And we just can't take it. We're hiding too much. We're carrying around too much burdens that we have not unloaded. That we have not given over and given up and dropped them and given them to God and say, I can't carry this anymore. And so it affects us. Now, the last point I want to make in this little section, when we confess, he forgives, he said. So we sit down and we pour out our heart and we talk about to God what we're struggling with, what we've done, what we own up to it. We don't have a deceit. We're not deceiving. We're not making excuses. We're not making the reasons be that for all the reasons we've done it, whatever we've done, that somehow it makes it okay. No, it says, Lord, I need help. I can't carry this myself. I can't solve this myself. That's when the burden is lifted. It's really a funny thing. I remember, when I was baptized, my early 20s, a little bit after college, and I remember really well, it's kind of like burned into my brain, this feeling after I was baptized of feeling like things and burdens were removed. And I didn't even go into it thinking that would happen. I mean, I kind of understood the process. I was calling upon God to cleanse me and forgive me, and I believed it. And I was like, wow. More often than not in this world, do people forget our transgressions? Do they really just kind of, oh, I know you did this to me, so set it aside. We're not going to ever worry about it or talk about it again. Do you get that from people, typically? No. We get it from God, though. And the burden just, I was a little surprised by it. I was baptized in a pool, big pool, and I just swam around. I didn't even know what to do, really. But it was really strange to me. It was a strange feeling. And I describe it as feeling much lighter. And that's what God is talking about. Removing and lifting the burdens that are just too much for us. So let's look at the another. And that is, praying before the flood covers you. Psalm 32, 6 and 7 says, therefore, let everyone who is godly offer prayer to you at a time when you may be found. Surely in the rush of great waters they shall not reach him. You are a hiding place for me. You preserve me from trouble. You surround me with shouts of deliverance. Now I want to give you an analogy here of what I was thinking about in this first verse especially. Everyone who is godly, offer a prayer when you can be found, when you can come to him, when you can go find him. And he says, surely in the rush of great waters, they shall not reach him. What is a rush of great waters? Isn't that a flood? In fact, isn't it almost the idea of a flash flood? I grew up, I've spent about 34 years of my life living near the coast of California. Or in California, near the coast. And in Northern California, often most of that. A lot more rain. Used to getting quite a bit of rain. Thought I knew what rain was, but I didn't really grasp the idea of flooding and things like that until I moved to the desert in Arizona. And how an hour you could go from barren and dry to flash floods. And to you can't pass, have a little Honda Civic and you couldn't pass in the streets because they're all too full. And that happened, in under an hour. I've never seen anything like that. And the idea of what he's talking about here, it struck me when I moved to Arizona, these massive canals. And I can't remember, are they the 100-year or 500-year flood canal system? Anyway, there's these massive canals that run through like Phoenix area. And all throughout them, they're hardly ever filled with water. In fact, they've never been as long as I remember or heard of, because they're like 100-year, 500-year floods, right? And these massive canals have parks all in them because they're typically no water goes through there. And so, but when a flash flood comes and hits the desert, it doesn't go into the ground anywhere, so it just runs somewhere. And so they have these canals to prevent all the homes from being flooded. If you didn't ahead of time build those canals, what would you do when the great rush waters came? Would you be able to do anything? If you hadn't prepared for something, when you saw it coming, would you be able to do anything? I think that's what God is talking about here. You have to think about the difficult times. Because as that verse we looked at in the very beginning of the first slide, many are the sorrows of the wicked. In verse 10 there. Well, isn't many of the sorrows of everybody? What is Jesus, one of the titles of Jesus, or one of the things he's called, is a man of sorrows. He has no wickedness in him. So how can a man with no wickedness be a man of sorrows, and the wicked also be full of sorrows? Because everybody who puts on this flesh is going to have sorrows. Doesn't matter how rich, doesn't matter how successful, it doesn't matter what you do or don't do, you are going to have sorrows. You will have grief, you will have trouble. And when those come, they can come upon you like a rushing flood and can overwhelm you. In fact, let's look at a passage, another passage, Psalm 69. If you have a moment, just turn over there. The first 3 verses. There's actually a whole bunch of verses like this in the Psalms, but in this specific one, I think he carries with it this concept of the struggles and troubles of life overwhelming us and flooding us. So in Psalm 69, first 3 verses, he says, "Save me, O God, for the waters have come up to my neck. I sink in deep mire, where there is no foothold. I have come into deep waters, and the flood sweeps over me. I am weary with my crying out. My throat is parched. My eyes grow dim with waiting for my God." He goes on to describe a lot of the troubles that are overwhelming him. But he describes the troubles of life overwhelming him like a flood, that he just can't catch his breath. He has no way to, it's one thing to be in water if you have like steps. Like you're in a big deep pool, but there are steps on the side with a handle. You feel pretty confident in the pool, right? But if you had a big deep pool and you had really high walls and sides that you couldn't get a handhold on or a foothold and nobody could lift you up, how confident would you feel inside just say an 8-foot deep pool with no way of getting out? How would you feel? Pretty soon you'd be feeling like you might be able to tread water for a while. You might be a really good swimmer, but how long would you be able to tread water? How long would you be able to float? Remember your training when you were a kid and had to float on your back for a while. How long before you'd be gasping? Because you didn't have a way out. That's what he's describing. Describing that water coming upon you that you don't have any way of getting yourself out of. And so you're calling upon God, save me. I think I'd give you another analogy. Think about this idea that he's talking about where the waters are coming. I've got to, I need to seek him while he can be found before it's too late. You're in a boat and they have life preservers, right? And everything looks fine and peaceful, and all of a sudden, but you're like, hey, it's so calm and peaceful out here, I'm just not going to wear it. I'm going to put it off to the side here. And then, a rushing great water just overwhelms you and sends away the life preservers. How much help are the life preservers if you didn't put them on beforehand? That's what he's talking about. We got to seek him. We've got to seek to put on the life preserver before it's too late. Because what happens in that rush? What happens when we're overwhelmed? Sometimes people get so overwhelmed with the struggles and troubles of life, they can't even pray to God. They feel like there's no help at all. That's usually what happens to people who get so overwhelmed, they almost shut down. And how do we overcome that? Who here remembers, and do you ever have that sneaking feeling, like Wednesday night, we had the power go off here a bunch of times. Emergency lights come on. You ever get that sneaking feeling that you should, in an emergency or an alarm goes off, that you should dive under your desk? I just remember all those years in school diving under desks in case of a nuclear attack. It's like, it trains us, doesn't it? It trains us with a response. That's why we do it ahead. That's why we prepare ahead of time. Trains us for a response. And that's what he's talking about. We need to seek out and search out for God's help and his saving before it's too much. And very often people think, oh, no, I don't really need God. I can take care of this myself. Oh, I don't need God. I can take care of this myself. Oh, I don't need God. I can take care of this myself. And then when it gets too much, very often we're too overwhelmed to seek out God. So let's look at another one here, Hebrews chapter 12, because carrying with it this idea that the struggles of life, don't you believe that God could take away every struggle of life that we have? Now, I confidently believe he could remove any struggle I have in this world. But he doesn't. Didn't do it for Paul when he had a thorn in the flesh, and he prayed with him 3 times, please, remove this thorn in the flesh. And I'm sure Paul was himself thinking, without this thorn in the flesh, I could do more, I could travel more, I could preach more, I could teach more. And God said, no. I'm not going to take away that struggle. So in Hebrews chapter 12, 3 through 11, he talks about this idea of discipline. And when we hear the word discipline, I think most of us probably think of the idea of corporal discipline or punishment, right? We think of somehow either corporal punishment like a spanking, which, some of us who are older, the principals did, right? Big paddle in their offices. And our mom and dad did, and now, it's like, oh, now we can call it child abuse typically in schools. But I want you to understand, the word discipline comes from the idea of education, that you're educating. That even in corporal punishment, if it's not to teach a lesson, then you're really not doing discipline. You're just striking out in anger, which serves no real great purpose. But he says here in verse 3, he says, consider him, talking about Jesus, who endured from sinners such hostility against himself, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted. So he says, think about Jesus. Think about how much he put up with from all the other people and all the things they did to him. So that he says, you can follow and do the things he did. So that you don't get tired, that you don't stop. He says, in your struggle against sin, you have not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. Now, Jesus did. Now, do you notice the verse there? He says, you have not yet. He didn't say you won't, like Jesus. He said you have not yet. You might. I might. I might struggle to the point of shedding blood. And he says, have you forgotten the exhortation that addresses you as sons? And he quotes an Old Testament passage, my son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor be weary when reproved by him. For the Lord disciplines the one he loves, chastises every son whom he receives. Does that description sound like that of a friend? Is that a description of a friend, or is that a description of a parent? Your parents are never going to be like a friend, like just another type. They may be a friend, you may love them, and they may be friendly, but if they do their job right, they will never be like a friend. Because they're not like a friend, iron sharpening iron. They're more like God disciplining his children, correcting them, teaching them, training them, chastising them, because that's their job. And so he says, if they don't do that, they don't really love you. You're not really their son. You ever been out somewhere and seen a child? We just spent, last week in Disneyland, happiest place on earth, where you need more discipline of children than any place in the world. Because for the happiest place on earth, there's more tears. But it really comes out, you can see the difficulty parents are having with children in that environment. And it is a struggle. It's hard on the kids sometimes. Sometimes the parents themselves are kind of putting a little too much on the kids, but you can see the challenge come out when they're little and trying to, run around the happiest place on earth. And the idea of discipline, of training, it really comes out at those difficult moments, especially, like when you don't want it to. Store. Kids seem to be aware every place it's going to be the most embarrassing for you as a parent for them to have a tantrum. They have a radar for that. I'm going to get them now. So the idea, he says, we've got to be listening to that correction. But he's telling us, notice this next verse. It is for discipline that you have to endure. Why we have to endure the struggles of life, it is part of the discipline of God. You ever think about it? I never really noticed this verse quite this way. I've read it lots of times. I know the passage pretty well, but this verse 7, where he talks about this is God's discipline. You struggling with life is part of him teaching you. Now I'm going to stop there just for time. I want to get to this next one because I want us to understand Deuteronomy chapter 6 in this context. And understand that life gives us teachable moments. And I know, if you do a parenting class or do most parenting kind of books, they almost all will deal with this chapter of Deuteronomy 6 that talks about to people to teach the commandments of God to their children and their grandchildren. And so here in just the first 7 verses, he says, "Now this is the commandment, the statutes and the rules that the Lord your God commanded me to teach to you, that you may do them in the land to which you are going over to possess it." This, by the way, is Moses talking to a younger generation, not the generation that came out of Egypt, but their children. After they spent 40 years and their parents all died, Moses is talking to a generation, the children of those whom he brought out of Egypt. And he's retelling them everything he told their parents. And he says, I've given you all these things, I've taught all this stuff because God told me to. And he's telling you that you have to teach them. That, he says, that you may fear the Lord your God and your son and your son's son by keeping all his statutes and his commandments which I command you all the days of your life, that your days may be long. Hear therefore, O Israel, and be careful to do them, that it may go well with you, and that you may multiply greatly, as the Lord, the God of your fathers, has promised you, in a land flowing with milk and honey. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children. You shall talk of them when you sit in your house and when you walk by the way, when you lie down and when you rise. You shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write on them the doorposts, or write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. So he says these words, they need to be with you all the time. You need to teach them to your children and your children's children. And you need to talk about them when you get up in the morning, when you walk down during the day, when you go to bed at night. You're going to have all these moments that are teachable to them. But you notice that the commands here are really to the person, not their sons as much. All those, when you walk by the way, when you rise in the morning, are they teachable moments only for the children? Or are they not teachable moments for us as well? When we walk by the way, when we rise in the morning, when we go to sleep at night, these moments teach us. How? He says, I'm holding on to the commandments and word of God. And then life happens, and I take the commandments with life, and I learn. It's what God was describing, that life, the struggles of life, are part of the discipline. Here's the teachings, here's the struggles. We connect the two together, and we understand God's ways. We understand God's righteousness, His love. That's what He's trying to get us to see. Let me just... So the last couple of verses, here in 8 through 11, he says, I will instruct you and teach you in the way you should go. I will counsel you with my eye upon you. Be not like a horse or a mule, without understanding, which must be curbed with bit and bridle, or it will not stay near you. And one of the things my daughter has taught me about horses, her love of horses and learning about horses. I've learned a lot of things about them that I didn't know as a kid, even though we had some horses when I was a kid. They were just more for riding around and, didn't really learn about them much. You ever seen those old westerns where the horse gets hurt and the cowboy takes out a gun and shoots him in the head and, kills them so they don't still there and suffer in pain? Well, apparently that's actually very hard to do because their brain is about the size of a walnut. That it's smaller than the brain that's in our two little mini dachshunds. And their skull is so thick and so hard that if you don't hit it exactly right, you're not going to actually hit it in the brain and kill it right away. You will just cause it more pain. And so they always show one shot, right? In reality, if people shoot them, they often take multiple shots to try and put a horse out. But he says, a horse or a mule without understanding, they're stupid. They are dumb, big, powerful animals that have absolutely no idea that a 100-pound girl is not stronger and more powerful than that 1,200 pounds they carry around. Because they're really dumb. They're an animal that's made to follow. They don't rule, they don't lead very well. They don't know what to do. But notice what he says, you don't want to be like them without that understanding, which must be curbed with bit and bridle. So you go out and you want to get a horse, even a horse you like, and you want them to come do something for you. What do you have to do? You've got to go get a bridle, and you got to put it on it. You got to have a lead rope at least, or if not, and you got to tow them. They come here. And then you had, stand here. Wait there. Without that, what will a horse do if sometimes, a bird flaps? They might bolt. They might take off. The joke in our house is every time a horse does that, we call it a cougar. When Janae was little, like 10 years old, she's like, every time they're afraid, they are an animal. They're not like dogs, which are actually predators. They are a prey animal. And so they're always afraid of stuff. They look huge, and people were afraid of them, and their weight, they can do a lot of damage to us. But in fact, they do a lot of damage usually in their fear, because they bolt and they run. And they even do a lot of stupid stuff when they do that. They hurt themselves. And so, but in order to get them to really trust you, typically you have to have the bridle on them and the rope. So then they go, okay, I'll just stand here by you. Something happens. Oh, I'll just stand here by you. You're in control. You need that for them to stand there by you and not do something stupid and get themselves hurt. He said, don't be like that. You shouldn't need a bit and bridle to stand by God so you don't get hurt. You need to have some understanding that I'm going to stand here by God. This is the best place to be. I'm not going to run and I'm not going to bolt, even though I don't have a rope. I'm going to stand right here with God because He'll take care of me. And he says, many are the sorrows of the wicked, but steadfast love surrounds those who trust in the Lord. I'm going to stand right here because I trust Him. And he says, my grace, my mercy, my kindness, my goodness, all that I am will surround you. Just wait here with me. He says, be glad in the Lord and rejoice, O righteous, and shout for joy, all you upright in heart. Talked about that a little bit last week, that we need to learn to count our days. Every one of us has a finite number of days. God probably knows the exact number. I think He absolutely does, but I say probably only because of my not knowing everything. And so, but we all have a finite number. What are we going to do with it? Well, hopefully every day we can rejoice and be glad. And in a lot of those days that we rejoice and be glad, we're going to have trouble. And we're going to have sorrow. And we're going to have challenges and difficulties. But we hopefully can overcome them standing beside God and knowing that His steadfast love has surrounded us. Now as you think about this, His instruction is with His eye upon each of us. I actually was looking at this verse very specifically. He didn't just say, my eye is on you, plural. He actually said, my eye is on you, singular. My instructions and your struggles in life have to do with my eye on you. So your struggles and your path have to do with your teaching, your discipline that God is giving you. His teachings, your struggles, all work together for the discipline of God. He says, steadfast love. Well, I said this. Steadfast love, this word, is about kind, good, merciful, loving, beautiful. Be glad and rejoice. And I'm going to of a psalm. I actually was kind of thinking I could go right into Psalm 33 because Psalm 33 is also about the steadfast love of God. But he says, our soul waits for the Lord. He is our help and our shield. For our heart is glad in Him because we trust in His holy name. Let your steadfast love, O Lord, be upon us, even as we hope in you. As long as I'm with you, everything will be all right. Be glad and rejoice.